Britain. A nation built on tradition, tea, and an ever-evolving sense of what's proper. But look back just a few decades, and you'll discover that everyday British life was filled with activities that would land you in serious legal trouble today. From the workplace to the home, from the high street to the pub, the Britain of yesterday operated under rules that would shock modern sensibilities. This is the story of 16 perfectly normal, perfectly legal activities that have since been consigned to history. Some changes came about due to safety concerns. Others reflected evolving social attitudes. But all of them reveal just how dramatically British society has transformed in a relatively short time. So let's step back into a Britain where things we now consider shocking, dangerous, or simply unacceptable were just part of daily life. Let's start with perhaps the most visible change in British daily life: smoking. Until surprisingly recently, Britain was a nation shrouded in tobacco smoke. In the 1970s and 80s, you could smoke virtually anywhere. Offices had ashtrays on every desk. Hospital waiting rooms provided smoking areas, sometimes just meters from the wards. Teachers smoked in staff rooms between lessons. And perhaps most shockingly, people smoked on buses, trains, and even airplanes. Imagine boarding a flight to Spain and finding half the cabin designated as a smoking section, as if cigarette smoke respected an imaginary boundary at row 12. The back of every bus had a smoky upper deck where passengers puffed away while traveling to work. Restaurants were divided into smoking and non-smoking sections, though the smoke obviously didn't observe these distinctions. You could be eating your Sunday roast while the family at the next table chain-smoked through their meal. The workplace was particularly remarkable. Office workers kept cigarettes next to their typewriters. Shop assistants smoked while serving customers. Even more incredibly, workers in certain industries, like mining, were given cigarette allowances as part of their compensation. All of this began changing in 2007 when England implemented a comprehensive smoking ban in enclosed public spaces and workplaces. Scotland had moved even earlier, in 2006, with Wales and Northern Ireland following suit. Today, lighting up in a pub, restaurant, office, or public transport would result in a fixed penalty fine of £50, with businesses facing fines of up to £2,500 for failing to prevent smoking on their premises. The transformation has been so complete that young people today find it almost impossible to imagine their grandparents' world of omnipresent tobacco smoke. The British relationship with alcohol has always been complicated, but the attitude toward drink driving was once shockingly casual. Before 1967, there was no legal blood alcohol limit for drivers in Britain. None whatsoever. You could down several pints at the pub, get in your car, and drive home without technically breaking any law, unless your driving was visibly impaired. Even after the introduction of the breathalyzer in 1967, social attitudes took years to catch up with legislation. Throughout the 1970s, it remained socially acceptable to have a few drinks and drive. Pub car parks were full every evening with vehicles that would later be driven home by decidedly tipsy owners. The designated driver concept didn't really take hold until the 1980s and 90s. Before then, the idea that one person in a group would abstain from alcohol entirely to ensure everyone got home safely was considered rather extreme. Police enforcement was also less rigorous. Random breath testing wasn't legal in the UK. Police needed reasonable suspicion before testing a driver. The Christmas drink drive campaigns that are now a fixture of British life didn't begin until 1976. Today, the legal limit in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland is 35 micrograms of alcohol per 100 milliliters of breath, or 80 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. Scotland has an even stricter limit. The penalties are severe: unlimited fines, driving bans of at least a year, and possible imprisonment. But in the 1960s, driving home after several pints was simply what people did. It was considered normal, even responsible, to drive carefully, after drinking rather than to not drink at all. For generations of British schoolchildren, the threat of physical punishment was a routine part of education. The cane, the slipper, the ruler across the knuckles, these were standard tools of discipline. Throughout most of British history, teachers had the legal right to hit children. The methods varied. In some schools, it was the cane across the palm or backside. In others, a leather strap called a tawse, particularly popular in Scotland. Some teachers used plimsolls or slippers, others preferred wooden rulers or blackboard pointers. The reasons for punishment ranged from serious misbehavior to trivial infractions. Talking in class, forgetting homework, arriving late, even giving a wrong answer could result in physical punishment. Some teachers kept detailed logs of canings, treating it as routine administrative work. Parents largely accepted this system. Many had experienced it themselves and considered it character building. The phrase, "spare the rod and spoil the child," reflected a widespread belief that physical discipline was not just acceptable but necessary for proper moral development. The abolition came gradually. Corporal punishment was banned in state schools in England and Wales in 1986, in Scotland in 1987, and in Northern Ireland in 1987. However, private schools in England and Wales could continue the practice until 1999, and in Northern Ireland until 2003. Today, any teacher who struck a student would face immediate dismissal, potential criminal charges for assault, and would certainly never work in education again. The cultural shift has been so profound that most young British people today are genuinely shocked to learn their grandparents were routinely hit at school. This one is less visible but potentially more harmful than almost anything else on our list. For decades, British motorists filled their tanks with leaded petrol, releasing toxic lead particles into the air with every journey. Tetraethyl lead was added to petrol from the 1920s onwards because it improved engine performance and reduced knocking. It was cheap, effective, and considered perfectly safe. The fact that lead is a toxic heavy metal that damages the nervous system, particularly in developing children, was either unknown or disregarded. By the 1970s, British cities were enveloped in lead-laden exhaust fumes. Children playing near busy roads were breathing in lead particles. Studies from this era show elevated lead levels in the blood of urban children, levels that would cause serious health concerns today. The phase-out began in the 1980s, driven by emerging health evidence and the introduction of catalytic converters, which required unleaded fuel. Unleaded petrol became widely available in Britain in 1986. Leaded petrol was finally banned for new cars in 1993, though remained available for older vehicles until 2000. Today, selling leaded petrol is illegal. The environmental and health impacts are well documented. Some researchers have even suggested that the decline in violent crime from the 1990s onwards correlates with the removal of lead from petrol, as the children who grew up breathing lead-polluted air aged out of the prime crime-committing years. For decades, every British motorist was legally participating in the mass poisoning of the population, and nobody thought twice about it. Modern parents are acutely aware of car seat regulations. Rear-facing seats for infants, booster seats for young children, strict height and weight requirements. The rules are complex and strictly enforced. But for most of British history, children in cars were entirely unprotected. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, it was perfectly normal to see children standing on the back seat, leaning between the front seats to chat with parents. Babies were held on laps. Toddlers bounced freely around the vehicle. The concept of a dedicated child car seat was foreign to most families. Even when seatbelts became mandatory for adults in 1983, children remained largely unprotected. It wasn't until 1989 that children in the rear seats were required to wear seatbelts if they were available. The comprehensive child car seat laws that exist today only came into force in 2006. Before these regulations, long family car journeys looked very different. Children would create little nests in the back seat, lying down to nap, playing games, fighting with siblings, all while the car traveled at 70 miles per hour down the motorway. The back window ledge was a popular spot for smaller children to lie and watch the world go by. The statistics from this era are sobering. Child fatalities and injuries in car accidents were significantly higher. But at the time, it wasn't considered neglectful or dangerous. It was simply how families traveled. Today, failing to properly secure a child in an appropriate car seat can result in a fine of up to £500. The transformation reflects both improved safety technology and dramatically changed attitudes toward child safety. Walk into a British home, school, or office building constructed before the 1980s, and you were almost certainly surrounded by asbestos. This miracle material was everywhere, prized for its fire resistance, insulation properties, and versatility. Asbestos was used in ceiling tiles, floor tiles, pipe insulation, roof materials, and even ironing boards. Schools were built with asbestos panels. Homes had asbestos in their walls. Office buildings were insulated with the stuff. It was cheap, effective, and considered completely safe. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, builders, electricians, plumbers, and construction workers handled asbestos daily without any protection whatsoever. They cut it, drilled it, sanded it, creating clouds of deadly fibers. Homeowners doing DIY projects would cheerfully saw through asbestos sheets without a second thought. The dangers of asbestos exposure, particularly the development of mesothelioma and other fatal lung conditions, were known in medical circles earlier than the public realized. But the material was so economically important that comprehensive action was slow in coming. Asbestos wasn't fully banned in the UK until 1999. Even today, many buildings contain asbestos that's considered safe as long as it's not disturbed. But disturbing it without proper licensing, training, and equipment is now a serious criminal offense. The legacy of Britain's asbestos era continues. Thousands of people still die each year from asbestos-related diseases contracted decades ago. What was once a routine building material is now treated as a hazardous substance requiring specialist removal. For younger British people who grew up with 24-hour supermarkets and Sunday shopping, this one seems particularly archaic. But until surprisingly recently, virtually all shops in Britain were required by law to close on Sundays. The Sunday trading laws had religious origins, rooted in the idea that Sunday was a day of rest and worship. Throughout most of the 20th century, with limited exceptions, shops simply shut on Sundays. If you forgot to buy food on Saturday, you went without until Monday or relied on the limited selection at corner shops that qualified for exemptions. The high street was deserted on Sundays. Supermarkets were locked and dark. Department stores were closed. Even petrol stations had limited opening hours. British families planned their shopping around this mandatory weekly closure. For shop workers, it meant a guaranteed day off, though often at the cost of 6-day working weeks. For retailers, it meant lost revenue but also reduced operating costs. For consumers, it meant planning ahead and doing without impulse purchases. The Sunday Trading Act of 1994 changed everything, though not without fierce opposition. Religious groups, some trade unions, and small shop owners fought against the change, arguing it would erode family time and community life. But proponents argued that consumer demand and economic reality made the old laws obsolete. The compromise allowed large stores to open for 6 continuous hours on Sundays, while small shops could open unrestricted. Today, Sunday shopping is so normal that many young people are shocked to learn their parents grew up in a Britain where it was illegal. Before 1983, British motorists could legally drive without wearing a seatbelt. In fact, many cars didn't even have them installed. The introduction of mandatory seatbelt laws was controversial. Critics argued it was government overreach, that individuals should have the freedom to make their own safety choices. Some claimed seatbelts were actually more dangerous, arguing they could trap occupants in burning vehicles or cause injuries themselves. The anti-seatbelt campaign seems absurd now, but it was significant at the time. When the law requiring front-seat seatbelt use came into force in January 1983, there were protests and predictions of disaster. Some drivers genuinely believed the government had no right to mandate this safety measure. The reality quickly proved the critics wrong. Deaths and serious injuries in road accidents dropped dramatically. The evidence was so overwhelming that rear seatbelt requirements followed, though not until 1991. But for decades before 1983, families would pile into cars with no restraints whatsoever. High-speed motorway journeys were undertaken with driver and passengers unbelted. Accidents that would result in minor injuries today led to fatalities. The human cost was enormous, but it was simply accepted as part of motoring. Today, not wearing a seatbelt results in an on-the-spot fine of £100. The cultural transformation is complete. Yet it's worth remembering that this basic safety measure is less than 4 decades old in Britain. Britain's anti-discrimination laws are now extensive, but there was a time when businesses could legally refuse service to customers based on race, religion, or national origin. The infamous "No Irish, no blacks, no dogs" signs that appeared in some boarding house windows in the 1950s and 60s were offensive, but they weren't always illegal. Landlords could refuse to rent to people based on their ethnicity. Employers could openly advertise jobs with racial restrictions. Pubs could refuse to serve certain customers. The first Race Relations Act of 1965 made some forms of racial discrimination illegal, but it had limited scope and weak enforcement. It wasn't until the Race Relations Act of 1976 that comprehensive protection existed. Even then, enforcement was challenging, and discrimination continued in more subtle forms. Similarly, discrimination based on sex was legal in many contexts until the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975. Before then, women could be legally refused jobs, promotions, or services simply because of their gender. Help wanted ads routinely specified male applicants only. Banks could require a husband's signature before granting a woman credit. Discrimination based on sexual orientation remained legal in many contexts until even more recently. The Equality Act of 2010 consolidated and strengthened protections, but significant legal changes have occurred within the lifetime of many Britons still working today. What's remarkable is how recent these changes are. People who remember when open discrimination was legal are not elderly relics of a distant past. They're in their 50s and 60s, often still in the workforce. The Britain they grew up in operated under fundamentally different rules about who deserved equal treatment. Environmental consciousness has transformed British attitudes toward littering, but this is a relatively recent development. For much of the 20th century, casually discarding rubbish was standard behavior. Cinema newsreels from the 1950s and 60s show crowds at sporting events or public gatherings simply dropping their litter on the ground. When the event ended, the ground would be carpeted with paper, bottles, and food waste. This wasn't considered antisocial behavior. It was just what people did. Motorists thought nothing of tossing rubbish from car windows. Cigarette ends were flicked onto pavements without a second thought. Sweet wrappers, newspaper bottles, all were casually discarded. The idea that individuals had a responsibility to dispose of their own rubbish properly was not widely accepted. Parks and public spaces employed armies of litter pickers not because littering had gotten out of control, but because it was simply expected that public spaces would need constant cleaning. The mess was considered inevitable. Anti-littering campaigns began in earnest in the 1960s with the "Keep Britain Tidy" movement, but changing behavior took decades. The Environmental Protection Act of 1990 gave local authorities stronger powers to find litterbugs, but enforcement remained patchy. Today, dropping litter can result in a fixed penalty notice of up to £150, potentially rising to 2,500 pounds if prosecuted. Some areas use cameras and plainclothes enforcement officers. Public attitudes have shifted dramatically. Littering is now seen as antisocial and shameful. But walk through any British town in the 1960s, and you'd see people casually tossing rubbish without anyone batting an eye. Children's toys in the mid-20th century would horrify modern safety regulators. Chemistry sets contained genuinely hazardous chemicals. Toy ovens reached temperatures that could cause serious burns. Projectile toys could take out an eye. Small parts presented choking hazards that manufacturers simply didn't worry about. Perhaps most remarkably, toys containing actual radioactive materials were sold to children. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, sold in the 1950s, contained real radioactive samples. It was marketed as an educational tool for budding scientists. The set included uranium ore and a Geiger counter. Lawn darts, known as jarts, were weighted projectiles thrown in a game similar to horseshoes. They had sharp metal points and were responsible for numerous injuries and deaths. They remained legal in the UK longer than in many other countries. Clackers, popular in the 1970s, consisted of two heavy acrylic balls on a string that could shatter, sending sharp fragments flying. Chemistry sets included substances like potassium permanganate and sulfur in quantities and purities that could be used to create small explosives. The toy safety regulations that exist today are comprehensive and strictly enforced. The Toy Safety Directive and subsequent regulations mandate extensive testing for everything from chemical composition to mechanical hazards. Age warnings, choking hazard labels, and safety testing are all legally required. But for generations of British children, playtime involved toys that posed genuine dangers. The injuries were real, sometimes severe. Yet it was considered a normal part of childhood. Parents simply didn't have the safety consciousness that exists today, and manufacturers weren't required to prioritize child safety over novelty and profit. Environmental regulations around waste disposal are now extensive, but for most of British history, the drains were treated as a convenient disposal route for virtually anything. Homeowners poured paint, chemicals, motor oil, and all manner of toxic substances directly down sinks and drains without a second thought. The concept that these substances would end up in waterways and could cause environmental damage wasn't part of public consciousness. Businesses were even worse. Factories discharged industrial waste directly into rivers. Photographic developers poured fixer solutions, rich with silver and other chemicals, down the drain. Mechanics disposed of motor oil through the sewer system. Dry cleaners released perchloroethylene and other solvents. The state of British waterways in the mid-20th century reflected this attitude. The Thames was so polluted it was declared biologically dead in the 1950s. Fish couldn't survive in many British rivers. The foam and discoloration in waterways was simply accepted as the price of industrial progress. The Environmental Protection Act of 1990 and subsequent water regulations transformed what could legally be disposed of through drains. Today, pouring hazardous substances down drains is a criminal offense with significant fines. Commercial waste disposal is strictly regulated and monitored. Household hazardous waste must be taken to designated collection points. Motor oil must be properly recycled. Paint and chemicals require special disposal. The elaborate system of environmental regulations that governs waste disposal today simply didn't exist for most of British history. The recovery of British waterways is one of the great environmental success stories of recent decades. Salmon have returned to the Thames. Rivers that were lifeless are now thriving ecosystems. But this recovery was only possible because activities that were once perfectly legal became criminal offenses. The employment rights that British workers take for granted today are remarkably recent innovations. For most of history, employment was precarious, arbitrary, and offered little legal protection. Until the 1960s and 70s, many workers had no written contract of employment. Terms were verbal, subject to change at the employer's whim. Workers could be dismissed without notice, without reason, and with no recourse. Pregnant women could be legally fired simply for being pregnant. There was no statutory sick pay, no maternity leave, no protection against unfair dismissal. The concept of a minimum wage didn't exist. Employers could pay whatever they wished, and workers could accept it or seek employment elsewhere. In practice, this meant wages in some industries were barely subsistence level. Working hours were unregulated. Employees could be required to work excessive hours with no overtime pay. Health and safety regulations were minimal. Dangerous working conditions were simply accepted as part of the job. The transformation began with the Contracts of Employment Act 1963, which required written terms. The Employment Protection Act 1975 introduced maternity rights and unfair dismissal protections. The Working Time Regulations 1998 limited working hours. The National Minimum Wage Act 1998 established wage floors. Today, British employment law is extensive and complex. Workers have statutory rights to holidays, sick pay, notice periods, and protection from discrimination and unfair dismissal. Violating these rights can result in tribunal claims and significant financial penalties for employers. But talk to older workers, and many remember a time when employment was far more precarious. Being fired on the spot was common. Working conditions that would trigger immediate health and safety interventions today were simply how things were done. Before the comprehensive advertising bans that exist today, cigarette advertising was ubiquitous in British life. More remarkably, many of these advertisements targeted activities and contexts we would now find shocking. Cigarette brands sponsored sporting events. The Embassy World Snooker Championship was synonymous with cigarette advertising. Formula One cars bore tobacco company livery. Cricket, football, and rugby all featured prominent cigarette sponsorship. Television advertising for cigarettes continued until 1965, when it was banned before the 9 o'clock watershed, and fully banned in 1991. But print advertising, billboards, and point-of-sale promotions continued much longer. Cigarette companies handed out free samples at public events. Brand imagery was everywhere. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities was the way cigarette advertising often implied health benefits or featured doctors and athletes endorsing products. Advertisements suggested smoking was sophisticated, masculine, or associated with success and glamour. The Tobacco Advertising and Promotion Act 2002 finally banned most forms of tobacco advertising and sponsorship in the UK. Today, cigarettes can only be displayed in plain packaging with graphic health warnings. Brand imagery is forbidden. Advertising is essentially prohibited. The transformation reflects a complete reversal in social attitudes. Smoking went from glamorous to dangerous, from sophisticated to antisocial. Activities that cigarette companies engaged in routinely, targeting youth, sponsoring sports, claiming health benefits, would now result in massive legal penalties. Fly tipping, the illegal dumping of waste, is now taken seriously by authorities. But there was a time when waste disposal was largely unregulated and dumping rubbish was common practice. Throughout the mid-20th century, people disposed of unwanted items by simply abandoning them. Old furniture, appliances, construction waste, all were dumped in convenient locations. Laybys, country lanes, and vacant lots became unofficial rubbish dumps. This wasn't always done secretively or shamefully. It was often considered reasonable waste disposal. The idea that you were responsible for properly disposing of your rubbish, even if that meant paying for removal, wasn't universally accepted. Businesses were particularly bad. Construction companies dumped building waste wherever convenient. Factories disposed of industrial waste in fields or waterways. The environmental impact was significant but largely ignored. The Environmental Protection Act 1990 made fly tipping a criminal offense with serious penalties. Today, being caught can result in fines of up to £50,000 or imprisonment. Local authorities use surveillance cameras, investigate waste, and actively prosecute offenders. The cultural change has been significant. Fly tipping is now seen as antisocial and criminal. But older Britons remember when dumping unwanted items in an out-of-the-way location was just what people did. The countryside was dotted with unofficial dumps that nobody considered particularly problematic. The final item on our list involves Britain's once lax attitude toward exotic pet ownership. Until relatively recently, keeping dangerous and exotic animals as pets was largely unregulated. Throughout the mid-20th century, people kept all manner of creatures that would now be illegal. Private zoos operated with minimal oversight. Individuals kept big cats, primates, venomous snakes, and other dangerous animals in homes and gardens. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act 1976 introduced licensing requirements for keeping certain species, but enforcement was variable and many exotic species remained unregulated. It wasn't until more recent legislation and EU regulations that comprehensive controls existed. Before these regulations, newspaper small ads featured exotic animals for sale. Someone could purchase a lion cub, a venomous snake, or a monkey with no more difficulty than buying a puppy. The welfare of these animals was often poor, and public safety risks were significant. Today, keeping dangerous wild animals requires a license from the local authority, involving inspections, insurance, and strict welfare requirements. Many species are completely prohibited. The illegal keeping of dangerous wild animals can result in fines and imprisonment. 16 everyday activities that were once perfectly legal, perfectly normal parts of British life, now prohibited or heavily regulated. The transformation reveals how dramatically Britain has changed in just a few generations. Some changes reflect improved scientific understanding. The dangers of lead, asbestos, and tobacco smoke are now undeniable. Other changes reflect evolving social values. Discrimination that was once accepted is now illegal. Animal welfare matters in ways it didn't before. Many of these changes have made Britain objectively safer, healthier, and fairer. Child mortality has plummeted. Air and water quality have improved. Workers have protections. Discrimination faces legal consequences. But these transformations also reveal something profound about how societies evolve. What seems normal, acceptable, even necessary in one era becomes shocking to the next generation. Our grandparents lived in a Britain that would be unrecognizable and often illegal today. And perhaps most thought-provoking, what aspects of our current everyday life will our grandchildren find shocking? What activities we consider perfectly normal today will be illegal or socially unacceptable in 50 years? The Britain of the past was not simply a quaint, old-fashioned version of modern Britain. It operated under fundamentally different rules, reflecting different values, different knowledge, and different priorities. Understanding this helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how much societies can change when evidence, activism, and political will align. These 16 prohibited activities are windows into a different Britain, a Britain within living memory but increasingly distant in attitudes and laws. They remind us that progress is possible, that societies can evolve, and that what we accept today may not be what we accept tomorrow. The everyday British life of yesterday would be illegal today. And that, overwhelmingly, is progress.